Today we're going to have a look at something that I've quite enjoyed researching. We're going to have a look at the character of my local landscape through what is apparently quite a unique feature. We're going to have a look at the antiquated and humble field barn. I recently became aware that England is split into national character areas. Each of these areas has identifiable landscapes, architecture, layouts of villages and towns, wildlife and soil types, things that make that area in particular unique. The area I am from is called the Leicestershire Vales. I'm going to quote from Natural England's description of the area, but I wanted to show you some footage of the landscape while I do. An open landscape of gentle clay ridges and valleys, occasionally giving rise to moderately steep slopes. There is an overall visual uniformity to the landscape and settlement pattern. Frequent small towns and large villages are often characterised by red brick buildings and attractive stone buildings in older village centres. Frequent imposing spired churches are also characteristic, together with fine examples of individual historic buildings. Hopefully that gives you a broad sense of the place, but what I find more interesting is Historic England's work looking at the unique layout of human settlement in this very specific place. One of these documents is available for every single national character area, and they're really wonderful. They give you a brief history of how the area has developed with the coming of the Romans and the development of market towns and whatnot. And it says that here medieval settlement was predominantly nucleated, villages and hamlets, and this has remained the characteristic of the valleys, lowlands and hills in the area, where separate villages can be seen clustered around tall church spires. It talks about large farmhouses that developed between the 16th to 18th century, that developed within villages, and that defined the organisation of the landscape. We have talked about the layout of villages before in this video about the wartime farm surveys, but you see in this village of Gilmorton, the farmhouses and farmyards are within the village itself, marked in green, and the land each of them farms will then stretch out away from the village. I guess this village layout would be very good for a sense of community because everybody lives near one another. But it's a very inefficient layout for agriculture because all of your buildings are in your yard at one end of your farm, so you have to walk all the way across it all of the time. Our farm is shaped like this too. It looks like a speech bubble. There's a block of land and then a little offshoot into the village where the original farmhouse was. Related to this, what I wanted to talk about today are field barns, like the one you see here. According to Historic England, field barns are a distinctive feature of the area and relate to village-based farms and landscapes of piecemeal enclosure. They say these small-scale field barns were for sheltering cattle and sheep, but are not capable of reuse, which is presumably why this one is falling apart. We're in the corner of one of my fields at the minute. My family came to this farm in the 1960s, but in the very early 1900s, the entire village and all of the houses and farms in it were owned by one person as part of an estate. But the estate was sold off in the aftermath of Lloyd George's death duties, which means I have sales particulars describing all of the farms in the village as they were then. And that says that right here there was a brick and slate cattle box with hovel adjoining, which if seen on a map is just a little rectangle. That particular field barn has somehow been lost to the sands of time, but I think it would have looked something like this, which is one still standing. This is of no agricultural use, so has become derelict, but it is a small building with one open side. It has a brick floor and a wooden hay rack. Today the only inhabitant was a barn owl, which to be fair, this is a very good habitat for. Quite a peaceful existence, I think, sheltered from the elements and hidden away, but able to look out at the goings on in the field. Just outside this barn I found an old horseshoe on the floor, which is quite a common sight, and also this little friend. But there are other surviving examples in slightly better condition. This one had a little corral out the front to pen the animals in and has 4 bays, one of which used to have a door before it fell off. The construction is pretty similar, with brick floors, wooden hay racks and even an owl box. This owl box is certainly lived in because I saw a stream of white liquid fall from the ceiling as I approached the barn. Presumably the owl had been sitting on this stick when it heard me coming. There was also a bird nest in the rafters, using the field barn to keep out of the weather. The land outside the barn also has a gentle ridge and furrow formation. And in the next field there is another field barn, a slightly smaller one in need of some repair. The drain pipe is broken and the entire building has a metal brace running through it to keep the brickwork together. There's no hay rack in this one, but you can see where it used to be, and the other bay has what looks to me like a pair of stalls with brick mangers where animals could be tethered. These barns confuse me a little bit because I'm not sure why they were ever a very good idea. A hovel I sort of understand because you could leave your plough up the field in it for a week of bad weather and save you lugging it all the way back to the farm. But keeping a small number of cattle in the corner of a field seems very inefficient because you'd have to go to them to give them hay every day when they could just be in sheds immediately opposite your house, which would save time. I asked my grandfather about this and he said it was probably because of muck. Housing animals over winter produces muck, which you want to return to the land, as this film explains.
For the middle of winter, all the cattle will have been brought in from the fields, and now they're fed on the mangles, grain and hay that we grew on the farm in the summer and stored away in the barns and yards during the autumn. Then the dung that collects in the cattle yards is taken and spread on the fields. Always put back into the land as much as you take out of it. It's another kind of rotation.
But muck is bulky and heavy and time-consuming to move. If it's already in the corner of your field, that would be much easier than carting it across your farm. So maybe that's the benefit of these strange little sheds. And of course, animals like to shelter from the elements in unpleasant weather just as we do, which is the continuing function of these sheds. In the storms we had a couple of weeks ago, I'm sure my sheep would have really appreciated a little hovel. Instead, they huddled beneath this tree. You can see the ground beneath it has been trodden quite a lot. I think this is quite amusing because the tree has no leaves on it, so I don't see that it would have provided them with very much shelter. They seem to think that it did. And it is a very beautiful tree, isn't it? It's very well proportioned and symmetrical. And I have spotted these little homemade hovel thingies that seem to have fallen out of use, but are presumably either shelters for sheep or creep feeders, which have troughs in enclosed spaces so lambs can get to them but their mothers can't. But field barns weren't the only agricultural structures that used to exist in this landscape. What's even weirder than that field barn that just isn't there anymore is that right here there used to be an entire yard that isn't here anymore either. Historic England calls these Outfarms. It was like a second yard situated outside the village, much closer to the centre of your farm. The sales particulars say this one consisted of a cattle shed, a store and a 4-bay brick and slate hovel enclosing. You can just make out some of the foundations, but these buildings have obviously been cannibalised over the years. Now this is one of the more wild extremities of our farm, with a stream and ponds and wild apple trees. There's some bits of tin here and there and some of my grandfather's homemade fence posts made out of split railway sleepers slowly rotting away, but that's about it. If it wasn't for these old documents and maps, I probably wouldn't even know there had ever been a yard here at all. I was thinking about field barns, these obsolete features of the local landscape, when I realised there are lots of post-war field barns, steel-framed buildings that must have served a similar function. Some of these seem like pretty good sheds. They're not small, but even in winter at the time of filming, they are unused. In this case, I think it's because they are difficult to keep an eye on. This one is right next to the road, so if you filled it with straw, somebody would set light to it, or if you parked a tractor in there, it would get stolen. Rural crime is a whole other issue, but perhaps it wasn't so much of a big deal when these buildings were put up. Either way, I think these are perhaps the modern equivalent of the field barn native to the Leicestershire Vales. But I did manage to find one still in use, although there's not much stuff being kept in here. Just a handful of bales and a few cattle, if you can see them. The light wasn't very good for filming. There were also a few red kites flying overhead. I counted at least 3. But there were field barns much fancier than any we've yet seen. The village of Aston Flamville has a pigeoncote built by the Lord in 1715, as it has written on it in brick, which was restored in 1977. This building used to house pigeons and functioned a bit like the early modern equivalent of a fridge. The birds would live in these pigeonholes, which is, for the office dwellers among us, where the term pigeonhole comes from. And they would provide eggs and meat as well as excellent manure. There was a little bit of that on the floor still, this particular building being unused by people, but still lived in. Similar to rabbit warrens, which we've talked about before, these buildings for keeping pigeons and doves would have been seen as symbols of oppression by the peasants in the village, because they wouldn't have been allowed to kill the birds that lived in here, or use the bird poo in their farming, as it belonged to the Lord. but these birds would have caused damage to their crops. The pigeons had to be protected from rats and weasels, so each layer has a brick shelf that juts out beneath it. This creates a step that it would be very hard for rats to climb round to get into the nests. I presume this is also the purpose of this band of bricks sticking out from the wall just beneath the numbers, to stop the rats climbing round and reaching the ventilation holes above. This was actually a very common way of stopping rats from getting to your crops. This is a big stone mushroom called a staddlestone, and if you drive round posh English villages, people will often have these in their gardens or along the roadside, and you often see them for sale in garden centres. But this is a real one that we dug up out of our yard by chance while laying some hardcore down. These are to stop rats getting to your food. If you have 4 or 6 of them laid out and build a little shed on top of it to put your grain in, the rats will know that there's food on top of the mushroom, as they always do. But as they climb up the side, they will find they can't get round the head of the mushroom, so your grain is safe from their devious little claws. And that's what the big stone mushrooms are for. The broader point here is that one of the things that is so beautiful about Britain is that there is local architecture. Things like field barns, whether or not people are actively conscious of them, do provide a connection to history and to culture that's remarkably specific to where people are. And I think these relics from times past help us think about the land and question how we should interact with it, which I think is very important. If we return to the village of Aston Flamville, besides the pigeoncote, it has lots of other historic features in its landscape. Just across the field is the church, which, like all village churches, has stood in place for centuries and has a design that is unique to this particular village. The graveyard is enclosed with white estate fencing, and just outside it is a phone box that, like the pigeoncote, is a protected building. I believe this one is still functioning, which is a very rare sight, but from the notices inside I fear that its time has come. The land around the village has gentle ridge and furrows which are still grazed today, which tells you that this land has been known and worked and lived on for centuries. All villages in Britain are this interesting. This one is just very easy to see. And the houses here are beautiful. They've done barn conversions here very tastefully, and I think it's very important that the character of places like this are preserved. There are a few difficulties there because there is a housing crisis, and what do we do about that? And the second problem, I think, is that these places are often not as accessible as I think they should be. The houses here are very expensive, but I think everyone should be entitled to a connection to their surroundings that a place like this offers, should they want it. And the other thing that I think is important here is that farmers have been placed at the centre of a culture war, so we must share our culture in a positive way, make it accessible. All farmers know their land practically, but also culturally. All farmers know the history of their land, and they know their family history and how the two are intertwined. Within the farming community, there is a living encyclopedia of knowledge about the landscape that is the heritage of all. If you live in a village and want to learn more about it, ask the farmers. They will have some good stories, I promise you. So thank you for watching, and thank you for 10,000 subscribers. I have been doing this for about a year now, and the consistent support of certain people from the beginning has been really appreciated. I feel we've cultivated a community of people who are genuinely interested in discussing the countryside and the food system in detail, which I feel privileged to be a part of. I have learnt a lot from you guys in the comments, and I would also like to thank the few characters who come back every week to tell me I'm an idiot. I feel it takes a certain type of person to have the patience to do that, and on 1 or 2 occasions you have been right. Next year looks set to be a pretty interesting one for the channel, as it does for all of British farming. We have very, very nearly finished the historical context I wanted to get through, and then we'll branch out and look at philosophy, the concept of nature, whether or not animal husbandry can be justified, and we'll look at science and discuss whether or not farming has been as bad since the Second World War as people seem to think it has been. And hopefully we'll get back to discussing how farming works on a practical level, get out and about, meet people doing cool stuff, and let them talk about what they're doing. And that's going to start next week, where I'm going to have a conversation with Liz Webster of Save British Farming, so don't miss that. On that note, the next stage of protests against the government are to take the form of letters written by children to be delivered to 10 Downing Street on the 2nd of January. So if you are a farming family and you want your children to carry on the story, get them to write a letter, post it to the address in the description, and it will be delivered on your behalf. And with that, do have a great holiday season however you celebrate, and as the tacky Christmas songs start playing on repeat, listen out for the rallying cry of the post-war cheap food policy, feed the world. And I'll see you next week.